Deep within the halls of modern architecture lies a story that challenges our understanding of design, space, and reality itself. When renowned architect Sarah Wright discovered something impossible within her creations, it sparked a journey that would forever change how she viewed the art of building. This is a story about the thin line between genius and madness, and how the spaces we create might sometimes create themselves. Now let us begin. The Prism Tower stood against the Manhattan skyline like a blade of glass and steel, catching the morning light and scattering it across the city below. Sarah Wright stood in the empty lobby of her latest architectural triumph, studying the clean lines and soaring spaces that had earned her firm yet another prestigious award. At 42, she'd already left her mark on skylines across 3 continents. But something about this building felt different. Wrong. The feeling had started during the final inspection. A nagging sensation that pulled at the edges of her consciousness, like a mathematical equation that refused to balance. She'd reviewed the blueprints countless times, yet here she was again, at dawn, walking the silent halls of her creation. Sarah's heels clicked against the polished marble as she moved through the lobby toward the executive elevator banks. Her reflection fragmented across the faceted walls. A design choice that had earned particular praise from the Architectural Review Board. But this morning, each reflection seemed to be moving at a slightly different pace, as though the light itself was struggling to navigate the space properly. The elevator ride to the 47th floor was smooth and swift. Yet Sarah's stomach lurched as though the car had dropped several floors. She checked her tablet, comparing the built reality against her original designs. Every measurement matched perfectly. Every angle was precise. Yet that feeling of wrongness grew stronger with each passing moment. She stepped out into the executive suite. A morning light painted long shadows across the premium office space. The layout was exactly as she had designed it, a series of private offices arranged around a central collaborative space, all oriented to maximize natural light and foster productivity. But as she walked the circumference of the floor, her practiced eye caught something impossible. The wall where the CEO's corner office should have ended continued for an extra 3 feet. She knew this because she had personally specified the dimensions of that office to accommodate the client's extensive art collection. This extra space simply couldn't exist. The building's exterior dimensions wouldn't allow for it. Sarah pressed her palm against the wood-panelled wall, feeling its solid reality beneath her fingers. Then she noticed something else. A faint seam in the panelling that shouldn't have been there. Her heart began to pound as she traced its outline. It formed a perfect rectangle, about 7 feet tall and 3 feet wide. A door. But there was no door in her plans. Not here. Not anywhere near this spot. She pulled out her tablet again, fingers trembling slightly as she pulled up the building's specifications. According to every document, every blueprint, every rendering, this section of wall should have been solid. The exterior of the building didn't allow for any additional space beyond it. It was architecturally impossible. Yet as she ran her fingers along the seam again, she felt a slight give, a whisper of air. And suddenly, memories began flooding back, memories she had somehow overlooked until this moment. The Jung Cultural Center in Singapore, the Aurora complex in Dubai, the Helix building in Chicago. All her major projects over the past decade. Each of them had felt wrong in some small way. Each had drawn her back for countless inspections. And now, standing in the impossible space of the Prism Tower, Sarah Wright realised why. In every building she had ever designed, there was a door that shouldn't exist. A door she had never drawn. A door that led to a space that couldn't possibly be there. The sun continued to rise over Manhattan, its light refracting through the Prism Tower's carefully arranged facades. But Sarah Wright barely noticed. She stood frozen before the impossible door, her world of precise angles and calculated spaces crumbling around her. And somewhere, in the deepest corners of her mind, a voice whispered that this was only the beginning. Over the next 3 weeks, Sarah Wright visited every major building she had designed. The pattern that emerged defied all logic and reason. In Singapore, behind a seemingly ordinary maintenance panel in the Jang Cultural Centre, she found it, another door, identical to the one in the Prism Tower. The Aurora complex in Dubai held its secret in the basement level, masked by a series of utility corridors that somehow contained an extra 30 square feet of impossible space. The Helix building in Chicago proved the most challenging. Sarah spent 2 days analysing its twisting structure before she located the anomaly, a section of the emergency stairwell that contained an extra landing, one that appeared on no official plans or documentation. And there, hidden behind a section of wall that should have opened onto empty air 40 stories above Michigan Avenue, she found another door. Each discovery sent ripples of disquiet through her carefully ordered world. Sarah had built her reputation on precision and attention to detail. Her designs were celebrated for their mathematical elegance and structural innovation. Yet here was evidence that something had been operating beyond her control, inserting these impossible spaces into her work without her knowledge. In her hotel room in Chicago, Sarah spread out photographs and measurements from each site. The doors were identical in every way, same dimensions, same subtle seam pattern in whatever material surrounded them. Even more disturbing were the markings she had begun to notice. Tiny symbols, almost invisible to the casual observer, carved into the door frames. They appeared to be some sort of ancient architectural notation, but none that she recognized from her years of study. Sarah's tablet chimed with a message from her office. Another design deadline was approaching, but she barely registered it. Instead, she found herself plotting the locations of her buildings on a global map. The pattern that emerged sent a chill down her spine. When connected, the buildings formed a perfect geometric shape, a shape that seemed familiar somehow, like a half-remembered dream. The symbols from the door frames matched this pattern. Sarah had spent hours researching their origin, delving deep into architectural history. The closest match she could find came from a set of controversial archaeological discoveries, ancient building sites that had puzzled researchers with their seemingly impossible architectural features. As she stared at her research materials scattered across the hotel room, Sarah realized that her entire career might have been leading to this moment. Every award-winning design, every celebrated innovation, had they been entirely her own? Or had some other force been guiding her hand, using her talent to create something far more complex than mere buildings? The sun set over Lake Michigan, casting long shadows across her impromptu investigation board. Sarah traced the pattern between her buildings again, her finger hovering over a point in the centre of the geometric shape. There was no building there yet, but she recognised the location. It was the site of her next major project, a commission she had accepted just months ago. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a text from an unknown number. The message contained just 3 words. They're all connected. Sarah's hand trembled as she set the phone down. The words echoed in her mind, confirming what she'd already begun to suspect. These doors, these impossible spaces in her buildings, they weren't isolated anomalies. They were part of something larger, something that had been growing alongside her career, hidden in plain sight within her own designs. As night fell over Chicago, Sarah Wright sat surrounded by the evidence of an architectural conspiracy that defied explanation. She'd found the pattern, documented the impossible, but one crucial question remained: what lay behind those doors? The answer waited in every building she had ever designed, in rooms that shouldn't exist, through doors she had never planned. And Sarah knew that soon, very soon, she would have to open one and step through. The Prism Tower's impossible door stood before Sarah Wright once again. After weeks of investigation, she had chosen to return to where it all began. Her fingers traced the familiar seam in the wood panelling, feeling the subtle resistance that had haunted her dreams. The morning sun had yet to rise over Manhattan, and the empty office floor felt like a tomb. This time, Sarah came prepared. Her tablet recorded everything, a steady stream of data from sensors she had brought to measure electromagnetic fields, temperature variations, and spatial distortions. If something extraordinary waited behind this door, she would document it. The scientist in her demanded evidence, even as her instincts screamed that she was about to step beyond the realm where conventional physics held sway. The door opened with surprising ease, swinging inward on silent hinges that shouldn't have existed. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she stepped through. The room beyond defied every law of architecture and physics she had ever learned. It was larger than the external dimensions of the building could possibly allow, stretching away into shadows that seemed to shift and breathe. The walls were covered in drawings, architectural sketches and diagrams that spanned centuries of human construction. Sarah recognized the impossible geometries of ancient temples, alongside modern sustainable design principles that wouldn't be developed for decades to come. Time seemed to flow differently here, with periods and styles bleeding into one another like watercolors on wet paper. As she moved deeper into the impossible space, Sarah noticed traces of recent presence. A half-empty coffee cup that still held warmth. Fresh pencil marks on one of the drawings. Notes in multiple languages, some she recognized and others that appeared to predate written history. This room had visitors, perhaps even regular occupants. The centerpiece of the room was a massive drafting table, its surface covered in blueprints that seemed to glow with their own inner light. Sarah approached cautiously, her senses forgotten as she took in the impossible document before her. It was a single drawing that somehow depicted every building she had ever designed, all interconnected in ways that made her head spin. But there was more. Hidden within the familiar lines of her own work, she found traces of other buildings, other architects. Names she recognized from history books and contemporary magazines alike. Each had contributed to this grand design, this blueprint of impossibility that stretched across time and space. A noise behind her made Sarah turn sharply. The cup of coffee had disappeared, replaced by a leather-bound journal that hadn't been there moments before. The room itself seemed to pulse with possibility, as though reality here was more suggestion than law. She approached the journal with trembling hands, knowing somehow that it had been left specifically for her. Inside, she found detailed notes in a familiar hand, the precise architectural script of Thomas Reid, her mentor who had vanished mysteriously 5 years ago. The journal's pages contained explanations for the impossible rooms, the connected doorways, the grand design that had been growing in secret for centuries. But more importantly, they contained a warning. Sarah sank into a chair that materialized beneath her, the journal heavy in her hands. According to Reid's notes, she wasn't just discovering these spaces, she had been chosen to create them, her entire career guided by unseen hands toward this moment. The buildings she had designed weren't just buildings. They were nodes in a vast network, a geometric web of impossible spaces that served a purpose she was only beginning to comprehend. The sun had begun to rise outside the prism tower, but in the impossible room, time continued its strange dance. Sarah Wright sat surrounded by the accumulated architectural knowledge of centuries, realizing that every design she had ever drawn had been leading her here. To this room. To this moment. To a choice that would determine not just her future, but the future of architecture itself. The disappearance of Thomas Reid had shaken the architectural world 5 years ago. The brilliant mentor who had shaped Sarah's early career had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only his unfinished designs and a legacy of revolutionary ideas. Now, reading his journal in the impossible room, Sarah began to understand why. Reid's investigations had started much like her own, with the discovery of doors that shouldn't exist. But he had gone further, much further. His notes spoke of a secret society of architects dating back to ancient Egypt, guardians of knowledge that humanity wasn't ready to comprehend. They called themselves the Geometers, and they had been shaping the world's cities for millennia. The journal entries grew more frantic as they progressed. Reid described meetings with other members of the society, architects whose names had been lost to history, but whose work still stood. They had shown him the true purpose of architecture, not just to create spaces, but to shape reality itself. The impossible rooms were nodes in a vast network, points where the fabric of space could be manipulated. Sarah's own buildings had been crucial to this network. Every award-winning design, every innovative solution she'd seemingly created from pure inspiration, all had been subtly guided by the Geometers. They had recognized her talent early, used Reid to mentor her, and waited for her to discover the truth on her own. As the morning light shifted through the impossible space, Sarah found photographs tucked between the journal's pages. They showed Reid in locations across the globe, standing before buildings she'd never seen in architectural journals or history books. These structures seemed to fold in on themselves in ways that defied Euclidean geometry, yet they were clearly real, captured in the unforgiving clarity of Reid's camera. More disturbing were the calculations that filled the margins of every page. Sarah recognized the basic principles: golden ratios, sacred geometry, advanced structural engineering, but they quickly evolved into mathematical concepts that made her head spin. These weren't just architectural formulas, they were attempts to quantify the impossible. Reid's final entry was dated just days before his disappearance. He had discovered something, a pattern within the pattern. The network of impossible rooms wasn't just a means of connecting distant points in space. It was building towards something. The geometers had a plan, one that had been in motion since the first human hands had stacked stone upon stone. Sarah checked the date against her own records. The day Reed vanished was the same day she had received her first major commission, the Jiang Cultural Centre in Singapore. The project that had launched her career and, she now realised, her unwitting participation in the geometer's grand design. Time moved strangely in the impossible room as Sarah pieced together the truth. The coffee cup reappeared, steam rising from its surface as though it had never been gone. New drawings materialised on the walls, showing variations of buildings she had designed but never built. Each one contained subtle modifications to her original plans, changes that would have made them perfect additions to the geometer's network. The implications were staggering. Every major city on Earth likely contained these impossible spaces, hidden within the works of architects who had been chosen, guided, and initiated into the society. And now Sarah understood her own role. She wasn't just discovering this hidden world, she was meant to become its next guardian. Outside the impossible room, the Prism Tower hummed with the beginning of another business day. But Sarah Wright remained in her chair, Reed's journal open in her lap, facing a decision that would reshape not just her understanding of architecture but of reality itself. The truth behind Sarah Wright's architectural signature had always been there, hidden in plain sight. Every building she had designed contained subtle references to ancient geometric principles she had incorporated instinctively, believing them to be her own innovative touches. Now, studying the walls of the impossible room, she understood their true significance. The geometers had developed a mathematical language that transcended ordinary architectural constraints. It wasn't just about creating buildings, it was about folding space itself. Each impossible room served as a nexus point, a place where the ordinary rules of physics bent to accommodate something greater. And through Reed's journal, Sarah had learned to read this language. Her tablet had long since stopped recording meaningful data, its sensors overwhelmed by the spatial anomalies surrounding her. Instead, Sarah focused on the drawings that continued to materialize on the walls. They showed her buildings, but not as they currently existed. These were variations, possibilities, futures that hadn't yet been realized. The network of impossible rooms wasn't static. It was growing, evolving, reaching towards some culmination that the geometers had been planning for centuries. Sarah's buildings formed a crucial new phase of this plan. The mathematical proof was there in Reed's calculations. Her designs completed a geometric pattern that had been developing since the first pyramids rose from the desert sand. As she studied the proof, Sarah began to understand the true purpose of her mentor's disappearance. Reed hadn't vanished. He had transcended. The impossible rooms were more than just connections between distant points in space. They were doorways to a higher understanding of reality itself. Each architect chosen by the geometers had contributed to this understanding, adding their own insights to the accumulated knowledge of centuries. The coffee cup vanished again, this time replaced by a set of drafting tools she recognized, Reed's old set, which had gone missing along with him. They were still in perfect condition, as though they had been used only moments ago. When Sarah picked up the familiar silver compass, she felt a surge of connection to every architect who had ever stood in this room, facing the same choice she now confronted. The geometer's knowledge was both powerful and dangerous. In the wrong hands, the ability to manipulate space itself could be catastrophic. This was why they had worked in secret for so long, choosing their initiates carefully, guiding civilization's architectural evolution from the shadows. The network of impossible rooms was their greatest achievement and their greatest responsibility. Sarah's next project, the one meant to complete the pattern, was already under construction. The foundations were being laid even now, in that crucial point at the center of the geometric web formed by her other buildings. But the final designs weren't finished. She'd been struggling with them for weeks, feeling that something was missing. Now, she knew what that something was. Time shifted again in the impossible room. The drawings on the walls began to move, showing the flow of energy through the geometer's network. Sarah watched as centuries of architectural history played out before her eyes. She saw how each chosen architect had contributed to the grand design, their buildings forming nodes in an ever-growing pattern of impossible spaces. The choice before her was clear. She could expose everything: the geometers, the impossible rooms, the hidden truth behind humanity's greatest architectural achievements. Or she could accept her role in their grand design, complete the pattern, and take her place among those who had learned to reshape reality itself through the power of pure geometry. Outside the impossible room, the Prism Tower continued its normal business day. But inside, Sarah Wright stood at a crossroads of architecture and reality, holding Reed's compass in her hand, preparing to make a decision that would echo through both space and time. In the end, prophecy came down to choice. Sarah Wright stood in the impossible room, Reed's compass in one hand and her tablet in the other. Tools of two worlds, two different ways of understanding space and architecture. The decision she faced would reshape not just her own future, but the future of architecture itself. The network of impossible rooms formed a pattern across the globe, a geometric web that had been growing for centuries. Each node represented a point where reality had been carefully folded by the geometer's designs, creating spaces that defied conventional physics. Sarah's buildings had completed crucial sections of this pattern, guided by knowledge she'd carried within her unconsciously since her earliest designs. Her tablet contained enough evidence to expose everything: photographs, measurements, sensor readings that proved the existence of architectural impossibilities. The world would never be the same if she revealed the truth. The geometer's centuries of work would be subjected to scientific scrutiny, their carefully guarded knowledge becoming public property. But as Sarah studied the drawings that surrounded her, she understood what such exposure would mean. Humanity's cities had evolved in concert with the geometer's plan, each impossible room adding to a greater design that transcended ordinary space and time. To reveal their existence now would be to disrupt patterns that had been developing since the first cities rose from the dust of ancient valleys. The room shifted around her as she contemplated her choice. Through the mysterious properties of these spaces, she caught glimpses of possible futures. In one, her revelation sparked a revolution in physics and architecture, but also brought chaos as people fought to control the power of spatial manipulation. In another, she saw herself following in Reed's footsteps, becoming part of something greater than individual achievement or acclaim. Sarah's next project called to her. The foundations waited at the center of the pattern, ready to become something more than just another building. In her mind, she could already see how to complete it, not just as a structure of steel and glass, but as a culmination of the geometer's grand design. Every impossible room in every building she'd created had been leading to this moment. The compass in her hand hummed with possibility. This had been Reed's choice too, she realised. He hadn't disappeared. He had transcended, stepping fully into the world of pure geometry that the geometers had been building toward. The journal, the coffee cup, the appearing and disappearing drafting tools, all had been his way of showing her the path. Time moved strangely as Sarah made her decision. She set down her tablet, letting go of the need to prove, to expose, to explain. Instead, she turned to the drafting table where the glowing blueprint showed the full scope of the geometer's vision. With Reed's compass in hand, she began to draw, adding her own contributions to centuries of accumulated knowledge. The impossible room responded to her choice. New drawings appeared on the walls, showing variations of her final design, not just as it would exist in physical space, but as it would exist in the higher geometry of the geometer's network. She worked through the day and into the night, though time had little meaning in this space between spaces. When she finally emerged from the impossible room, Sarah Wright was no longer just an architect. She had become a geometer, a guardian of spaces that existed beyond ordinary reality. Her final project would soon rise at the heart of the pattern, completing a design that had been in motion since the first human beings dreamed of building toward the sky. The prism tower stood silent in the pre-dawn light, its impossible door once again hidden within ordinary walls. But now Sarah knew that throughout the world, in buildings old and new, spaces existed that defied conventional geometry. And in those spaces, the work of the geometers continued, shaping reality itself through the perfect language of architectural design. As the sun rose over Manhattan, Sarah Wright began planning her masterpiece. Not just a building, but a bridge between what was possible and what waited beyond the edges of ordinary space. The impossible rooms would remain a secret, known only to those chosen to understand that architecture was more than just the art of creating spaces. It was the art of reshaping reality itself, one impossible room at a time.